Let us switch now to today's speaker. Welcome, Matt, to our live stream.
Thank you.
And Matt Hurteau is an associate professor of quantitative ecology at UNM. His research focuses on climate change mitigation and adaptation in forest systems. He uses empirical and simulation data to better understand how changing climate and disturbance influence species distribution, productivity, and carbon dynamics. And we found Matt, I hadn't heard of Matt at UNM until we read his article in the Washington Post, which is another great reminder that journalism opens up all kinds of fascinating doors. And Matt, welcome. We've found you, and now we would love to hear everything that you have to say. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks, Sandy. I appreciate the invite and the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my talk screen here. All right. So today I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing to try and better understand how climate change will interact with wildfire to influence the landscapes that we live in and then the landscapes that we're dependent upon. So when we think about the way that climate change influences wildfire, we've got to go to what's commonly known as the fire triangle, right? So this is the same idea that firefighters use when they're trying to basically suppress fire, and that the idea being that you knock out one of the legs of the fire triangle. So when we think about climate change's influence on this, so climate change is not influencing the atmospheric oxygen concentration. In this case, heat is really referring to ignition source, and we've got plenty of those on the landscape. We've had plenty of those, so both in terms of lightning and also human-caused ignitions. You know, historically, those were indigenous, intentionally lit fires, and you know, more recently, they're oftentimes unintentional ignitions. And so, really, that has no relationship to the climate system whatsoever. And so the way that climate influences wildfire is through the third leg, which is fuel. So there's a strong positive relationship between increasing temperature and increasing area burned. And the mechanism behind that is actually the amount of moisture contained in particular, dead vegetation or fuel. And so as the atmosphere warms up, the amount of moisture it's capable of holding increases. And so that's basically acting as a giant sponge, sucking water, moisture out of the ecosystem, both in terms of dead fuel, but also live fuel. And what that does is it makes the ecosystem more available to burn. And so we've got to think about this in the context of the relationship between you know, these different aspects of the Earth system. So there's the climate system operating at a planetary scale, right? But there are feedbacks that occur. For example, the role of forests in helping to moderate the global climate. So forests take up roughly 3 billion tons of carbon per year on a global basis. So they're making a large contribution toward offsetting some of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. The climate system directly influences disturbance, as I mentioned, making vegetation more available to burn in the case of fire. But then this relationship between forests and disturbance can also influence the climate system. So forests take up carbon and they also store that carbon. So through photosynthesis, they're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and assimilating that into woody vegetation. When that vegetation burns or even gets killed, eventually that carbon is emitted back to the atmosphere, either directly through combustion or through decomposition over time. And so that influences stored carbon, but it also influences what we refer to as source sink dynamics. So a green forest taking carbon up out of the atmosphere is a sink for carbon. And when we kill that forest, it becomes a source. So it's releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And so really understanding many of the feedbacks in the system is kind of a key objective of the work we do in my research group, and is really important for understanding how the dynamics that play out amongst these systems will influence our landscapes going forward. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So I mentioned carbon an awful lot in that previous slide. And so this is simply a currency we use to evaluate forests. So if you think of any given tree on the landscape, roughly half of it is carbon. And so if you want to think about successional development over time, so we start with no forest and eventually a forest grows in a place, the carbon stock, or the amount of biomass that accumulates at that place, increases over time. And this has a lot to do with successional processes. So we might start with grasses or shrubs, and then eventually trees begin to establish. And as they grow, they store more carbon. And then eventually we hit a mature forest condition, which is going to be our highest amount of carbon on that landscape. And so in the idea of a carbon carrying capacity is there's some level of carbon that can be stored per unit area. In this case, if we have a wildfire occur, and we have the same prevailing climatic conditions and natural disturbance conditions that occurred before that wildfire, we expect that patch of ground to achieve the same amount of carbon storage as it did before the fire. However, if the climatic conditions change or natural disturbance conditions change, like say fire becomes more frequent, it can alter the state of that ecosystem. So we might transition from a forest to say a shrubland or grassland, and that's going to store considerably less carbon. So it's going to have less of a mitigating effect on the climate system. And we're already seeing examples of this occurring, particularly here in the Southwest, but other places as well. So today I want to talk about 4 questions that are related to the carbon carrying capacity of these ecosystems. And so the first is about the interaction of climate and wildfire and how that influences carbon across large landscapes. Then I want to talk about feedbacks between these systems, and in particular, the idea that a wildfire occurring and burning up vegetation could act as a limit on subsequent fire size. And so trying to understand what that contribution is of previous wildfires to subsequent wildfire size. And then I want to talk a bit about what we can do to help manage the way that wildfire interacts with these ecosystems and what that means in terms of the amount of carbon stored in the system. And those 3 questions I'm going to address by talking about work we've done in the Sierra Nevada and California. And then for this final one, talking about how what happens to carbon dynamics across the landscape in the absence of any sort of management. So what happens when we have high severity wildfire and how ecosystem dynamics unfold after that. And so for that, I'm going to take us back here to northern New Mexico in the Jemez Mountains. So for these first 2 questions are going to be dependent on some work we did with the simulation model called the Landis 2 landscape, it's landscape disturbance and succession model. And so what we do when we want to model a landscape is we use forest inventory data and satellite data and soil data, and we basically reconstruct or construct the ecosystem in a simulation environment. And then we parameterized the species in that ecosystem with our understanding of their life history traits and physiology. So from a life history perspective, it's things like seed dispersal distance. So not all species have the same dispersal distances because the weight or heft of their seeds varies. So for example, an aspen will disperse a lot further than an oak simply because the seeds are considerably smaller. And then we bring in information about the topography, so things like aspect and elevation. And we couple this with an ecosystem model where we model carbon and nitrogen dynamics in the system. So we can feed projected climate data to this and then model wildfire occurring and see how that influences the way the system behaves. And so this distribution down here is basically to signify that we provide the model with distributions of fire size, and then each each time a fire is simulating, we sample from that distribution to estimate the maximum fire size that could occur for that particular event. So as I mentioned, we're over in the Sierra Nevada for this set of simulations. And this was work led by a former PhD student of mine for her dissertation, Shuang Lang. And what we did in this study was we asked the question, how would changing climate and its interaction with area burned influence carbon dynamics across this landscape? And so to do that, we used projected climate data from 3 different climate models that have good fidelity for this region. And then for that area burn distribution or fire size distribution I showed in the previous slide, my colleague Leroy Westerling at UC Merced ran some statistical simulations between projected climate and area burned, and that's how we parameterized that particular distribution. So we expected that we would see fairly large changes across the Sierra Nevada mountain range in terms of which of the dominant tree species remained dominant versus which dropped out of the mix, and how much biomass or carbon we would expect to see stored by dominant species. And we were a bit surprised by the results. So I want to orient you to these figures, and you're going to see a few of these. And so we've got the mountain range. And then this map on the left, BSWF, is baseline climate and wildfire. So that's just using, contemporary climate run over and over again and contemporary wildfire to serve as a comparison for our climate change projections with wildfire. And so these 2 maps, what we did was aggregate into these large grid cells, the dominant species by biomass. And the difference between these 2 maps in terms of which species are containing the most biomass is pretty negligible. And so the only thing that we did find different is actually up here, you can see in these little whisker plots, is the amount of carbon stored in the landscape between the baseline, so these black dots, and the projected, these red dots. And so at low elevations, so this is below 1190 meters elevation, and at mid elevation, so between 1190 and 2100 meters elevation, we see the projected climate and wildfire actually causing a decrease in the amount of above ground carbon stored in the system. But if you look at the distribution of that, it's not a big change in terms of the species. And so this was a bit surprising to us, but really the driver behind that is the amount of fire on the landscape is still relatively rare. What was interesting, though, was what happens in terms of recruitment, or the amount of tree seedlings establishing on the landscape. So this figure shows the same study area, and then these combinations of letters at the bottom are just the different climate model projections. But the punchline to this figure is that we see large fractions of this landscape where we see a greater than 50% reduction in the number of recruitment events for tree seedlings. And so you might imagine that as recruitment goes down, the chance that we sustain forest in a given location also decreases. The other interesting thing was that we saw big shifts, particularly at the low and mid elevation bands, which are right here, in terms of the dominant species that were establishing. And so under projected climate and wildfire, we saw a big increase in the number of pine species, which were the dominant ones to regenerate, and a decrease in the more in species that we tend to associate with wetter environments, like firs. And so we saw a shift in what we expect this future forest to be just based on recruitment because of projected climate and its interaction with wildfire. And so if you play that out over the course of this century and we start looking at what that means in terms of species richness, so just the number of tree species per unit area by late century, we see a big reduction in what are fairly species-rich temperate forests, temperate conifer forests. We see a reduction in particularly this mid-elevation band, the number of grid cells, so the number of areas across that landscape that are supporting a larger number of species. And so that's going to have implications for the kinds of habitat that this mountain range is able to support. It's also going to have implications for the long-term carbon dynamics. So that got us wondering, you know, the regeneration question, so the tree seedling establishment question was interesting, and that suggests that we could expect changes to occur over longer time periods, changes that we didn't necessarily see reflected in the overstory. And so that made us think about what could be driving that dynamic. And one of the things is we were running simulations over the course of this century, and we're modeling species that live for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. And so it's going to take some time for these ecosystems to equilibrate with any change in climate. And our results about tree regeneration suggested that wildfire could act as a catalyst for that ecosystem change, providing an opportunity for the vegetation to equilibrate with that changing climate space. And so here in the Sierra Nevada, we've got a Mediterranean system. So the vast majority of the precipitation is falling in the winter. And a big fraction of this mountain range is really dependent on snowpack and the development of that snowpack over the winter and its slow melt in the spring to provide growing season moisture. And so this figure I've got on the right here is related to these three transects. And so south is correlates with the blue, I'm sorry, the south with the red, the central with the green, and the north with the blue. And these are snowline elevation under projected climate. And so what you see is basically across the mountain range, the mean snowline elevation goes up by about a couple hundred meters. And so that means there's a significant decrease in the land area of this mountain range that will maintain a persistent snowpack throughout the winter because of elevated temperature. So we wanted to understand how that might influence vegetation dynamics if we assume climate stabilization at late century conditions. And so what we did in this case is for these three transects is we ran simulations that used projected climate through 2100. And then we used the projected climate from 2090 to 2100 to create distributions to sample from of climate data. And then we ran these out for several hundred years. So we're making the assumption that projected climate stabilizes the end of this century. And then what does that do in terms of how vegetation conditions change on the landscape as it's interacted with wildfire? And so this next series of figures, these three panels are all set up the same. So across the top, this is baseline climate and wildfire in these black box and whisker plots. And then for each transect, and then I've got the north in blue, the middle transect in green, and the south in red. And so for this first panel, this is total ecosystem carbon. So this is all the carbon in below ground and above ground. And what we see is that under projected climate conditions over a longer time period, the amount of carbon that the ecosystem can store drops dramatically. And part of that has to do with the fact that the proportion of area that is capable of supporting forests also drops by 40 to 60%, depending on the transect you're in. So under projected climate, following enough time to interact with wildfire, we see a contraction in the forested area across the Sierra Nevada. And this has some pretty big implications for both total carbon stored, as we saw in panel A, but then also in terms of the carbon flux, so the amount of carbon the ecosystem can take up. And so that is what we call net ecosystem carbon balance. When it's below zero, it means that the ecosystem is a source of carbon to the atmosphere. And when it's above zero, it means it's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And in each of these conditions, the median value is either at or below zero for each of those transects, because between 35 and 50% of the land area for each of those transects becomes a source of carbon to the atmosphere, because we're seeing a shift away from trees toward shrub and grass vegetation. It's burning more frequently. And then over time, as that transition occurs and trees die and are killed and are consumed by subsequent fire, they're a source of carbon to the atmosphere. So if we're looking at, the Sierra Nevada under projected climate and wildfire, these simulations suggest declining species richness, reductions in tree regeneration, lower total carbon, and then a reduction in the forested area, which means that a larger fraction of the landscape is a carbon source to the atmosphere. And this is really important because, well, one, I mean, just if you're a forest ecologist, it's important because we're trying to understand these ecosystems. But from a societal perspective, it's important because the state of California, as part of its climate action plan, is depending on natural systems in the state to take up roughly 30% of its annual emissions over time. And so this work suggests that that's a bit of a gamble, that these ecosystems are not necessarily going to continue to be a sink for carbon, that they may transition into a source for carbon. But, as we worked our way through this project, it got us to the point of wanting to think about that vegetation fire feedback some more. So when a wildfire does occur, it consumes a lot of biomass, and fire is by nature a self-limiting process. So if you burn up biomass, that area that burned is less available to burn in the future because there's less fuel available. And so most simulation work that is done does not account for this feedback. And so what we sought to do was really understand, as these ecosystems become more flammable, do we expect to see a change in the amount of fire on the landscape or the fire sizes? And so to do that, we actually re-estimated these fire size distributions at each time step based on simulation output. And so that's just the kind of the quick and dirty of the work we did to couple these relationships in the model. And so we ran those same three transects with what we call the static condition, which is the results I was just talking about, where there's no relationship between prior area burned and subsequent area burned, and then the dynamic where we account for that relationship. And so in this figure, I've got area burned in square kilometers for each of these transects. And the solid line is the dynamic and the dashed line is that static. And across the transects, we see varying decreases in the amount of area burned. Over the course of this century, it works out to about a 2,500 square kilometer reduction, or roughly 7.5% reduction in the area weighted total area burned across the Sierra Nevada. And so that's a pretty small amount, but what it got us curious about was how it influenced fire size. So when we looked at the largest fires, not the largest total, but just the upper, say, 25% of fire sizes, we found that in the early part of the century, there wasn't really any difference in fire size. And this has to do with the fact that a large fraction of the landscape hasn't burned yet. So there's plenty of fuel available. By mid-century, we start to see these separate. So the dynamic, the median value starts to drop lower than the static. And the star indicates that there is a significant reduction, statistically significant reduction in the largest fire sizes, or in the upper quartile. And then in late century, we see that persist. And you can actually see, especially in terms of some of the larger fires, reduction here. But it's, these are upper quartile, so that's still some smaller fires in terms of, things that we think about in terms of fire size that impact society. So we also wanted to look at the absolute largest fires. So when we look at the absolute largest fires, these are the ones that, make the news. These are the ones that burn up towns, like the 2018 fire that burned the town of Paradise in California. And we were curious to see how that vegetation fire feedback would impact these. So again, early century, no difference in terms of the very biggest fires. By mid-century, we see a statistically significant reduction in the largest fire size. And these values here, so this is 9,700 hectares, that's the median under the dynamic, and 21,000 hectares is the median under the static simulation. But we also simulate fires much larger than that because that's not especially large. But then by late century, that goes away. And so what that tells us is that, you know, there can be an effect of fire limiting its subsequent size, but that is relatively short-lived, somewhere on the order of a decade or so, before an area that's burned becomes available to burn again. So we don't expect to see a big reduction in the flammability of these landscapes because of that feedback between fire and vegetation. So just to recap that bit, we see reductions in the largest wildfire size, mid-century, but we're really only accounting for about 7.5% total reduction in area burned over the course of this century. So it's an important piece, but it's not going to save our bacon in terms of seeing reductions in the amount of wildfire on these landscapes going forward. So one of the questions that we've been tackling a lot over the last, say, decade or so is really trying to understand how our influence on these ecosystems has changed carbon dynamics because of the way we have screwed with the disturbance regime, in particular the fire regime of these ecosystems. So across large hunks of the Western US, historically we had relatively frequent fires that maintained these ecosystems. They tend to keep the forest more open, much more variable in terms of tree density across space. And those were maintained by fires, particularly surface fires that burn through the ecosystem on the order of years to decades between fire events. So generally we think of more frequent fire forests as fires occurring every 40 years or fewer. And then, of course, we put those fires out starting first starting with overgrazing, which removed a lot of the fine fuel, bringing us back to this fire triangle. But then over time, through active fire suppression as a land management strategy, we've increased the amount of fuel available by both keeping fire out from burning the fuels that build up on the surface, like pine needles and stuff like that in this picture, and dead plant material, dead branches from trees, but also by increasing forest density. So regular surface fires like this would kill off a lot of tree regeneration, young small trees, and keep the forest much more open and variable in terms of structure. And so that's had an effect on carbon. It's increased the amount of carbon stored in ecosystems, but it really begs the question of what that means in terms of the stability of the carbon in those ecosystems. So this figure on the right here is postulated, carbon stability for ecosystems maintained by regular fire in the back. So the idea being that they store less carbon, have a lower carbon carrying capacity for live carbon, and then that amount of carbon is far less variable. Versus if we exclude fire from the system, the amount of carbon stored in that system can build up above the carbon carrying capacity, so above what would be under normal circumstances, the fire regime or prevailing natural disturbance conditions of the system. That changes the way that fire interacts with the ecosystem, and it can cause dramatic drops in the amount of live carbon stored in the system. And so, but it begs the question, what happens if we restore this process? So we've got to deal with all this carbon in the ecosystem that's currently not in the atmosphere. And what does that mean in terms of the carbon balance of these ecosystems and their role in moderating climate? So we know from about 5 decades of research at this point that we can change the way fire interacts with these ecosystems and undo some of the effects of fire suppression through things like mechanical thinning, so cutting out smaller diameter trees, prescribed burning, which is manager ignited fires, and then managing natural ignitions or managed wildfire, which is pretty common, say in the Gila wilderness here in New Mexico. And the scientific evidence supporting these is strong, and as a result, the two previous administrations had committed a fair amount of resources and support for managing our forests to help mitigate some of the risk of stand replacing wildfire. I just want to take this opportunity to point out, though, that while there's a great deal of evidence for mechanical thinning and prescribed fire and managed fire changing the physics of the ecosystem, that contrary to what President Trump says, there is no evidence that raking the forest will do anything to moderate fire behavior. So that gets us to the third question of this talk. And you know, what we set out to do was try and understand how these management activities, which require the removal or emission of carbon from the system, how that would influence the overall carbon balance, and what that would mean in terms of the forest's ability to help continue to mitigate climate change. And so about the time that we were doing this work, one of my colleagues had published a paper on the pace and scale of these efforts that were being implemented across the Sierra Nevada. And what that work suggested is that while treatments were being implemented, they were not being implemented at a large enough scale or at a fast enough pace in order to modify fire behavior across large landscapes. And so again, what we decided to do was evaluate basically the pace question. So we know the scale question. We've got to tackle a substantial fraction of the landscape to modify the way that fire interacts with it. But we also wanted to more focus on this idea of the pace at which we do that work. And so we came up with this management prescription where in all areas that it's legal to operate, because oftentimes this thinning is done with machinery. So we need shallower slopes, and that can't be in riparian areas, and it can't be in national parks. And so for all areas that are legally operable, we simulated a mechanical thinning treatment where we remove about 30% of the biomass. So cutting out a lot of the, you know, the smaller trees that you see in a picture like this and leaving the larger trees in place. And then we simulated prescribed burning based on the frequency that's ecologically appropriate for the forest type. So in this picture here, I've got Sierra mixed conifer forest, which is from a research site I work at. And the fire return interval for this particular spot is on average 17 years before we started putting fires out. So we had different frequencies depending on the particular forest type. And so we did the treatments exactly the same between our two scenarios. But in one, what we did was we distributed the treatments out across the entire century. So 12% per decade were treated. And then in the other, what we did was accelerated the implementation and said, okay, we want everything treated in terms of thinning, and then the first entry burn by mid-century. And then looked at how that would impact carbon dynamics. So first, I'll show you what that meant in terms of fire severity. So in this figure, we've got area burned, and these are in thousands of hectares. And a hectare, just for those who don't know, is roughly 2.5 acres, to give you some comparison. And what we've done here is bin it up by fire severity. So these red areas are the most severe, and second most severe. So these 4s and 5s. And that's tree killing wildfire. So that's the stand replacing wildfire that's atypical of these fire maintained ecosystems. And then this class 3 is common of mixed conifer forests. So that's where it's mostly fire on the forest surface, on the forest floor. And then periodically we have patches that get where mature trees get killed by fire. And then classes 1 and 2 are just surface fire. And so both the accelerated and distributed treatments reduced the amount of class 4 and 5 fire severity area. So it reduced the amount of stand replacing wildfire in the system and increased the amount of area that was getting surface fire. So it had the desired effect for why we implement these treatments. And what that meant, excuse me, in terms of carbon stability in this ecosystem, or carbon loss from the ecosystem, is that, so let me explain this figure real quick. So we've got each decade of the simulation, and then the first bar in each decade is no management, and the second bar is accelerated, and the third is the distributed treatment scenarios. The bottom color here is emissions from wildfire. The dark green color is emissions from prescribed burning. And the light green color are the carbon losses from thinning. So we just treated these as emissions, even though it might end up as wood products. So running these out, basically what we see is that the combined losses from the system from management, so the light green and the dark green, have the effect of causing higher carbon losses than the no management case early on in these simulations. And then as we move forward through time, by about mid-century, when we've implemented all of the treatments in the accelerated case, we see a substantial reduction in the amount of carbon loss from the ecosystem. And so there's A and B are just the statistical significance. So significantly less carbon loss, or significantly lower carbon losses by mid-century. And then by the end of century, we see the accelerated and distributed are both significantly lower than the no management scenario. So what that tells us is that while we sustain higher carbon losses early on, we can expect lower carbon losses from wildfire down the road. And that actually results in higher carbon storage across this landscape. So this is just a change in carbon stored on the landscape from the start of the simulation to the end for the accelerated, distributed, and control. And then here I've differenced them from the control. And what you've got are large fractions of the landscape storing basically 5 metric tons per hectare more than the control scenario. So that ecosystem is storing considerably more carbon and taking up more carbon, helping to mitigate emissions from human sources. So, you know, we were all thought this was interesting, and it had been important for helping to shape, you know, the discussion with Air Resources Board and different regulatory bodies in California about the potential for using cap and trade dollars to manage these ecosystems, so climate change mitigation dollars. And then 2012 to 2016, a pretty significant drought event occurred. In the southern Sierra Nevada, the estimates were in the neighborhood of 100 million or so trees killed. By the end of the drought, Sierra-wide, there were roughly 150 million dead trees killed, or trees killed. And then enter 2020, right? And the Creek Fire, which is a rather big wildfire burning in the Sierra Nevada right now, has ripped through this area, and it's volatilizing a lot of that carbon in the atmosphere. And so our model estimates, we figure, probably are underestimating the effects of these events on the ecosystem. So we've been working, as I mentioned, at a long-term experimental site in the southern Sierra Nevada called the Tea Kettle Experimental Forest, looking at different treatments. So we had looked at different levels of thinning and different levels of burning in these treatment units that were each 4 hectares, so roughly 10 acres, where we had stem mapped all of the trees before treatment in the late 90s, and then implemented the first thinning and burning treatments in the early, like 2000, 2001. And then we've been tracking these trees over time, trying to understand different things about the effects of management on the ecosystem. And so come 2017, in several years before, we had put in a grant proposal to burn the experimental again, because that was about the mean fire return interval about 17 years after the initial treatments. And as we were writing the proposal up, all we had were data that were 10 years post-treatment before the drought. So we didn't have a real way to estimate what the drought effects were at the experimental forest. And so that also led us to wonder what that meant in terms of tree mortality from the drought and how that varied by treatment. And so in this figure, what we've got are the probability on the y-axis that a tree survives given the amount of growing space in square meters that it has available to it. And so this kind of orangey color are large trees, so 75 centimeter diameter at breast height, so that's 1.7 meters off the ground, or I'm sorry, 1.37 meters off the ground. So big, really big trees, and then kind of medium-sized trees, so 25 to 75 centimeter diameter of this teal color, and then small trees. And what we find here, if you look at the control, is that as growing space increases, the probability of survival goes up for all three of these size classes. And the important thing to note here is that, you know, one, we see this strong positive relationship, and we also see relatively little variability. And that's because in the fire suppressed forest, there are relatively few trees that have this much growing space. And so when we look across the different treatments, we see in, say, the understory thin and burn, a big increase in the probability of large trees surviving. But there's also a lot more large trees that have more growing space once we've done these treatments. And so we did find an effect of treatment for some of these different management options on the probability of big trees surviving. And the reason we care about big trees is that's because that's where most of the carbon in the ecosystem is stored above ground. And so the other thing we wanted to look at was the influence on the amount of dead surface fuel. And so I've got the treatments that involve no thinning on the left here, and the one, I'm sorry, no burning, and then these are the burning treatments. And what you see is our last measurement before the drought, we had relatively lower amounts of surface fuel. So these are things like tree branches, and litter is pine needles, and then 1,000-hour fuels are like big logs on the ground. And then after the drought, we see a big increase. So 2017 is our first post-drought measurement in terms of the amount of surface fuel. And then we were curious if this prescribed burn we were going to implement would bring that back down. And it did, in fact, decrease the amount of biomass in the surface fuel pool, which is good because that helps moderate future fire behavior. But we had expected that this kind of second entry burn would have lower total emissions than the first one because there should have been less fuel in the ecosystem after burning the first time. What we found, though, is that in some cases, like this burn in understory thin, we saw an increase in the amount of carbon emissions to the atmosphere because of all that tree mortality needing to be dealt with. And so that really led us to a conclusion that we didn't necessarily expect going into this, and that is that we're going to need to continue to sustain relatively large emissions of carbon to the atmosphere through management in order to decrease the chance that we have these big, hot, standard replacing wildfires, and that as the climate continues to change, the amount of carbon that ecosystem can store is going to go down, and the only way to deal with that is through things like restoring regular fire to the ecosystem. So that brings me to, what happens if we choose to do nothing? So as I showed you in our Sierra-wide simulations, carbon losses are decreased significantly when we choose to actively manage the forest versus doing nothing. And part of that has to do with what happens to the forest and its development over time. And so some colleagues and I published this paper earlier this year where we were looking at wildfire-driven forest conversion across the West and trying to understand what we know and what we don't know and synthesize that information to help guide subsequent research. And so a lot of us on this paper have been working on this topic for several years. And I've been working here in New Mexico and asking the question, what happens to carbon in the absence of any sort of management? And so part of that is really trying to understand what happens to a landscape like the east flank of the Jemez Mountains here in the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, where fire killed most of the trees. And so this map is a fire severity map of the less conscious fire. And all the red area you see are high severity areas. So that's 95% or more of the tree cover was killed by wildfire. And so when you have really large patches of high severity fire like this, it's going to take a considerable period of time for trees to move into that, because pine tree seeds, particularly ponderosa pine, are relatively large and they don't travel that far in the wind. And then there's also the question of, as we're in this new kind of droughty environment and it's much hotter without tree cover, if they get there, are they able to survive? So because seed sources are limited in an environment where you only have maybe a few live patches of trees here and there, there's been lots of effort to plant in these landscapes. So we decided to implement a planting experiment where we looked at how seedling survival would vary as a function of aspects, so more northerly versus more southerly, and also vegetation cover, under shrubs versus out in the open, because of the way that modifies the microclimate. And so the idea being is that more northerly aspects have lower surface temperatures than the south-facing ones. They're going to have higher relative humidity than the south-facing ones, and less incoming solar radiation. So things like aspect and shrub cover are going to buffer some of the changes that occur as a result of wildfire. So we planted across this landscape, and we've been monitoring both seedling survival as well as microclimate amongst all these sites. And so we put up a bunch of weather stations, and then, these poor people who, my students who helped install all this stuff, we're working through New Mexico locust, which is always unpleasant because of its thorns. And, we planted seedlings and built these little solar radiation shields to instrument with small sensors to measure the seedling environment. And then we mapped the thing with drones so we could get real high resolution imagery. And what we found is that we can explain about 17% of the variability in the landscape just based on things like slope and measures of the topographic complexity of the landscape. And then we get another 16% of the variability explained with that first year's spring precipitation and then maximum vapor pressure deficit, which is basically how dry the atmosphere is. And so, that's a nice step forward with about 33% of the variability, which will improve our ability to model it. But it still begs the question, this landscape is still flammable. All this vegetation is still available to burn, and how will fire influence that development over time? So we ran a series of simulations for that less conscious fire footprint where we varied the probability that wildfire occurs. And there's only one thing to take home from this figure here, and that's that this is low, medium, and high probability. And that as fire, this is fire count on the x-axis, as fire becomes more common, a larger fraction of the landscape is made up of resprouting shrub species, so that's this green color, and then grassland or herbaceous plants and not woody vegetation. And so fire can actually lock this system into a non-forested state if it's too frequent. And that has very significant implications in terms of the ability of that ecosystem to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so this is just the difference in the medium probability and high probability fire scenarios from the low probability scenario in total carbon uptake, so photosynthesis, across this landscape over a 50-year simulation. And you see 4 teragrams is a substantial difference from the lower probability scenario, which means that this landscape is going to take up and store much less carbon and help buffer the climate much less going forward. And that's a bit problematic if we think about our relationship with the climate system from a fossil fuel perspective. So these 4 questions help kind of tie up a few pieces of not only improving our understanding of the way these different systems interact with each other, but also what are the costs and benefits of us intervening in this process from a climate mitigation perspective. And so The importance of this work is that we're trying to answer some of these more management oriented questions and then make sure this information makes its way to the policymakers so that it can feed in to help us make better policy choices for dealing with climate change. And so, in California, we're talking about $1 billion investment in improving forest management because of the role forests play in buffering the climate. Here in New Mexico, we've seen increases or changes in the way we think about our forests, and then a planned effort to improve reforestation after wildfire in order to help mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And all this information is useful for helping to inform those efforts. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the number of folks that have worked on the projects I talked about today. We've gotten funding for this work from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the Joint Fire Science Program. And I just want to draw your attention to my lab website, hurteaulab.org, and there is a outreach page that has videos and data visualization and stuff like that if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. And thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. Wow, I feel a whole lot smarter about climate change and wildfire. That was superb. Folks, the floor is open for Q&A. I have, as usual, one or two questions I'd love to ask you. And Matt, I wonder if you could take us around the world a little bit to Australia or other Mediterranean climates and comment on kind of what you see abroad and whether there are things to learn from abroad and how we manage fire and climate change mitigation efforts here in the United States.
Yeah, so as I'm sure most people know, that last year was a record-setting year for Australia too, right? Big wildfires, and I say last year, it was really December, January, right? So very recent past. So we're seeing, because of the relationship, positive relationship between increasing temperature and area burned, we're seeing places like Australia become more flammable. And so, these record-setting wildfires, we're seeing some more wildfire occurring in places like South Africa. There are upticks in area burned in places like Portugal as well. And then, so areas that are already flammable, climate change is making more flammable. And these areas where fire is fairly common, like say the Western US, Australia, I mean, these are places that burn with a great deal of regularity, and they're burning more often. And in some cases, we're seeing larger wildfires. But then the places that we don't think of as being especially flammable, some of them are becoming more flammable with climate change as well. So several, not 2020, but 2017, 2018 were record-setting fire years in British Columbia. So big, impactful wildfires. And these are, these have everything to do with the fact that as temperature goes up, the number of months per year where these ecosystems are available to burn is increasing. And so we can expect to see more of that in some places as with ongoing climate change.
Interesting. I got a couple questions from the floor here. One from Linda Barker is asking about how much of your data is based on actual field sampling versus modeling or simulations?
Yeah, so the landscape stuff we have to do in a modeling environment, right? Because we're dealing with species that live for hundreds of years, and none of us live that long. And then also just your average career length, right? And then in order to do things over a large spatial scale, we also have to do modeling. But underpinning all of those simulations are many field studies. So for example, the seedling planting study I was talking about in the Jemez, kind of the impetus for that was to build a better regeneration model for these post-fire environments in the Southwest. And so of the studies I talked about, the data from the tea kettle experimental forest and then those tree planting studies were empirical manipulative studies, but data from those studies and also from some of my colleagues' work in different geographic locations is underpinning that modeling work.
Okay. Let me ask you, let me imagine a big philanthropist came to you and said, I love your work, let's scale it up. If you had an unlimited budget, where would your work go? What would you do?
That's a fantastic question. No, I think, one of the things that has occurred this year that kind of took my breath away is how quickly basically California and then hunks of Oregon became consumed by flames this fall. Um, a lot of the work that we've done, we model big fires, and our models say big fires are going to occur, going forward. But our projections were for those big fires to happen in 20 or 30 years from now, not this year, right? And so one of the things, if I had an unlimited budget, I would want to kind of zero in on would be would want to better understand the relationship between these kind of extreme events, which are driving the fire season this year along the west coast of the US and also Australia, and how we can better represent that mathematically. And so, when I talk about the relationship between temperature and area burned, that's at broad scales over long time periods. But the way fire burns and interacts with the vegetation and how quickly it spreads, that's a very fine scale process, right? So it has to do with, wind speed and things like how dry the fuels are and the topography of the site. And so figuring out how to better represent that information in these larger scale models would be a way for us to better characterize the impacts of these wildfires on society.
We have a couple questions here about the effect of climate change on other species. So from Jimmy Allen, he says, how do you account for other climate change effects, such as the change in insects that might impact the trees, and climate change causing forests to be more susceptible to insects and other factors?
Yeah, so that drought event in California, it wasn't necessarily a direct effect of drought killing the trees. It was making them more susceptible to things like bark beetles. And a lot of the tree mortality that occurred in the Southern Sierra was, beetles that specifically target pines, like mountain pine beetle and Jeffrey pine beetle. And so we don't necessarily account for beetles. We've done some work modeling insect impacts on forests, but what we can do is, it's depending on the question we're asking, we're more interested in, do the trees die, and not necessarily the mechanism by which they die. So if we can kill them, in the simulation environment, the exact mechanism is less important. It's more the conditions under which that is likely to occur.
Okay, and a related question from Felipe Klessig, is anyone conducting studies of the effect of fire size and ferocity on wildlife? As in, do the hotter fires decrease wildlife, such as deer and birds, more than frequent smaller fires, making it harder for them to come back?
That's a good question. There's been some work in Australia recently looking at those big fire impacts on things like the koala, and the amount of wildlife mortality estimated from those big wildfires. Here in the States, a lot of the research that's been done so far is really looking at the impacts of these big hot fires on what are typically classified as kind of old forest species. So species that occur in old growth. And actually, there's a gentleman here in Albuquerque that works for the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, and he's done a bunch of work in the Sierra on the California spotted owl and the effects of these big hot wildfires on spotted owl habitat versus more frequent fire maintained forest. And his work points to some real benefits for wildlife habitat for these old forest species in restoring frequent fire to these ecosystems.
Okay. Question from Herb Thomas. Given that many management strategies result over time in less than ideal carbon sequestering, would it make sense to go back to the old Smokey Bear strategy of trying to prevent all fires?
So we still have the Smokey Bear strategy, right? You can still see Smokey on commercials, on billboards, on signs as you enter the national forest. And basically, if you think of fire suppression from like an evolution lens, right? What it has done is it has selected for, it's been a selection pressure on the system for much larger wildfires. It's done that by increasing the amount of biomass in the forest and then homogenizing the forest. And so it's created these conditions where these big wildfires can burn. And the big fires that we see now are only about 1% or less than 1% of the total fires that start. And so it's under these extreme conditions that we get these big wildfires. And we are not going to stop ignition source, right? Some of it's lightning, some of it's unintentional human caused. And so we have to figure out how to better live with fire in these landscapes and how to modify the way fire interacts with the landscape so it's less impactful, both to us and to the ecosystems.
Okay. Question from Renee. Is your work currently impacting how fires in New Mexico, such as the recent Medio fire, are being fought? If not, what's standing in the way of implementing recommendations based on your studies? If yes, how is the strategy for containing that fire changed by your insights?
So that's a good question. I would say that the work we're doing so far is not impacting fire suppression strategy anywhere. And the reason being that, once a management agency makes the determination that they're going to suppress a fire, they have, the strategy for safety and effectiveness are what rules the day. But where we are having an effect on the way things are done, I think the Santa Fe fire shed is a good example. We did a simulation study of basically the Sangres to the east of Santa Fe, inclusive of the municipal watershed, and looking at how these management activities are placed on the landscape and what that means in terms of modifying the risk to that landscape of burning under high severity fire. And I have spent quite a bit of time with folks on the Santa Fe National Forest, both in the office and out in the field. And it's helping to shape the way they think about the work they're doing on the ground in terms of bringing more of the right kind of fire back to those ecosystems.
And do you find New Mexico state government to be receptive of a lot of your work and approaches? Is that an easy task?
Yeah, so our current state forester, Laura McCarthy, comes from a background of, forest conservation, forest management. And under her guidance, New Mexico has been developing its latest 10-year forest action plan. And so she had asked me to participate in that process. And so I provided, feedback and stuff like that, and kind of my thoughts on what the science says about what the best approaches are for managing these ecosystems. And it's been great. I find that our state forestry department is very much interested in assimilating, the latest science into their decision making.
Right. Well, maybe the last question I'll ask you is, let's flash forward, 25 years. My kids are now in their mid 30s. Are they living in northern New Mexico? What kinds of changes? And this is pure speculation, but where are we going to be given all of these things that are happening now? What does the future from where you sit look like?
Yeah, so I think the future, it depends on our choices, both locally and globally, right? And so let's just say, let's say we continue on our current path of emissions. So, the climate's continuing to change. And frankly, 25 years out, even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, the atmosphere is still warmer. The ecosystems are still more flammable. So then the question becomes, what can we do about this locally? If we choose to change the structure of the vegetation on the landscape and restore regular surface fire to these more fire-prone systems, in 25 years, we're going to have more forest than we would otherwise. And even going out further, right, it's about having the right tree in the right place for the end of this century. but it's going to be fire that causes the biggest changes on our landscapes. And if we change to having more of, like the right kind of fire, good fire on the landscape, we're going to have much more intact forest than we would if we choose to do nothing.
So, final question.
Yeah.
Given the weight of a lot of the work that you do and a lot of, just the destruction and of course regeneration of through fire, what gives you the greatest room for optimism as we look to the future?
Mountain biking? No. I think the biggest thing is that particularly here in the South, I like to think of the Southwest as we're kind of the canary in the coal mine for Western forests. We've been warming up first. We were already warm and dry, and we're getting warmer. And so we're experiencing climate change sooner than the rest of the West, but we're starting to see places like California warm up a lot more now. And eventually that's moving up. And what gives me hope is that, and optimism, is that we're seeing that our ecological understanding of these systems, if we manage them based on that, even as things warm and dry and we have more potential for fire, we can sustain forested ecosystems in the Southwest. Like, it's not something that we have to be, that we're going to become one giant grassland or something like that, or it's all going to become a, grassland and juniper woodland. It's, we can sustain these, pine and mixed conifer forests if we choose to, to manage them for the right kind of fire.
Well, Matt, thank you very much. That was a wonderful walkthrough of some complicated but essential stuff, and we're very grateful. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandy. I appreciate it.
Good, and we can find more information on that website. Actually, let me just type it into the chat window just while we're here to make a record of it. Will you just tell me the website for your lab?
Yeah, it's Hurteau lab.org.
Okay. So there it is in the chat window. If any of you would like to get more information on Matt's fine work, take a look. And once again, Matt, thank you so much for doing this. And we look forward to seeing you in person one of these days.
Me too. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. You take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.